Hello again, it is I, the Doge that reads, back again with another tabletop RPG horror story for your listening pleasure. In today's episode, we have a follow-up from the episode entitled Cringe Edgelord Ruins Games and Bullies Players. So if you would like to listen to that story first, I will post a link to that one in the pinned comment. In this story, we find what became of the bullied player from that story, Freddy, only to find out that he himself isn't so innocent. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe as it goes miles to help the channel grow. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's get right into the story. INCEL stalks, harasses female gamers, Freddy follow-up. By Reddit user, Princess Arabelle. This story is a follow-up to my original post about a toxic and abusive member of our regular DnD group. A couple of people asked about the fate of Freddy, one of the players central to that story, especially when I indicated that Freddy's own toxicity later led to us removing him from the group as well. I feel the need to include a content warning for the following, as this story involves sexual harassment and emotional manipulation. Our D&D group would meet twice a week to play in 2 different games. It was quite a large group, 7 or 8 people at its largest, with 3 women taking part, 4 if you count Jill, a Belgian girl who attended a session 0 for a game I was set to run, but left the country before the campaign could get started. More on that below. If you've read my previous post, you're already familiar with Freddy, a shy, nervous, anxiety-ridden player who was mercilessly bullied by a toxic member of our group who, last summer, we finally kicked out. Our group reassembled as our country relaxed its lockdown restrictions last June, and we started playing a handful of new campaigns. Freddy was a lot more relaxed than he was in previous games we'd played together, and it seemed like he'd rounded a corner following his mistreatment at the hands of that toxic player. Around this time, I started up in a relationship with one of the girls in the group, Mina. She had mentioned in passing that Freddy had asked her out at the start of lockdown, which she gently turned down. Neither myself or her thought much of it at the time, though as summer ground on, she began to get increasingly wary of Freddy's almost weekly messages asking to go on a walk with her in the park next to where she lived. Wary, but not enough to turn him down. The walk just so happened to be consistently delayed by life commitments, and me being over at hers most weekends. We did, however, start to notice Freddy's behavior after games would wrap up for the evening. He would always hang around outside the venue we played at, waiting for Mina to finish packing her things, then making a point to walk with her even to the point of ignoring his bus stop so he could continue to follow her. It reached the stage where she no longer felt comfortable walking out of D&D alone, and asked me to hang back and keep her company until Freddy finally went home. Even still, she saw this as just his awkwardness, that he hadn't quite gotten over his crush on her from earlier in the year, and didn't know how else to behave. Eventually, something Freddy said in a message to her spooked her, and she became convinced that he was getting set to ask her out again. She headed him off at the pass and let him know that she liked him very much, as a friend, but that she wasn't exactly looking for a relationship right now. Mina and my relationship at this time was not public knowledge within the group, and even between ourselves, we had not exactly settled on calling it a relationship at that point. Freddy seemed to accept this at face value, but doubled down on his request to go for a walk with her in the park. He grew increasingly more insistent, and tipped Mina into deciding not to meet with him after all. She confided in me that she expected him to ask her out, again, and that she just didn't want to have to face that in person. She had a lot going on in her personal life, between being cut off from family back home thanks to the lockdown and some ongoing drama with some longtime friends. So adding Freddy's behavior on top of it all was just too much for her to think about. Separate to all of this, I had agreed to meet Freddy, in a park ironically, to discuss his ongoing battles with depression. He needed a shoulder to cry on, and I was more than happy to lend an ear. Over the course of a long heart-to-heart, he eventually intimated to me that he intended to ask out Mina again, that doing so would be different now that he had had this talk and was, quote, no longer a little boy, but a man. His words. Me. Hasn't she told you no twice already? Maybe you should leave it. Freddy. This is just something I feel I have to do. Me. I don't know. I think maybe it's best if you just focus on yourself for now. Freddy. That's exactly what I'm doing. This will be cathartic for me. Try as I may, I couldn't talk him out of his now confirmed plans to ask Mina out, for a third time. When I told her this, she got very visibly distressed, until I decided I could try to ward him off by coming out with our fledgling relationship to him. She accepted this, though was a little pissed off about the implication, that her preferences didn't matter so much as her relationship status. And as I was leaving her place that night, I messaged Freddy to deliver the bad news. Me. Hey dude, there's something I think I should come clean about. Mina and I are sort of together since this past week or so. I hope that doesn't cause any issues between us or anything. This was a lie. Mina and I had been together for well over a month and a half at this stage, but whatever. I almost instantly get back this voice-recorded message of Freddy crying and sniveling and saying that he, quote, fucked it all up. He's, quote, ruined everything. And he was such a, quote, little boy and, quote, didn't know how the world works. Those of you who have read my first post, you'll recognize Freddy's penchant for wailing despair. At the time, I took it as just him being a little pitiful, and tried calming him down by reassuring him neither Mina or I had anything against him. In the weeks to come, we'd all reevaluate our reaction to this behavior by Freddy. Now, at this time, our country was locking back down thanks to woeful mismanagement by the government. Instead of scrapping our games, we elected to flout the regulations. You didn't read that here. And gather for games instead at another player's, Virginia's, house. Another name you'll remember from my previous post. I was to carry on running a game of Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition I had started playing just before lockdown got reintroduced. Mina's first game of Vampire, which she threw herself into full tilt by buying wigs and costumes with which to portray her vampire character, a young bratty gangrel zoomer named Sugar. She later confessed that she thought the low-cut tops and short skirts she wore during this game probably didn't do much to dissuade Freddy's attention. One of Virginia's housemates around this time was an aspiring actress named Jill, who was over here from Belgium to attend an acting course. She was really intrigued by the prospect of role-playing games, especially as Virginia had mentioned that we tended to be a role-play heavy group, so Jill asked if she could join. Naturally, we were all really excited to get to roleplay with an actress, and we had a space at the table now that the aforementioned toxic player had been removed. So we invited her eagerly along to a Session 0 for what was to be another Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition game, DM'd by me. We ended up not finishing Session 0 that night, as Freddy, Mina, and myself had to run for the bus, leaving everyone, Jill included, with half-finished character sheets. We ended up never finishing those sheets because shortly after that, Jill suddenly announced that she was moving back to Belgium, abandoning her course here. Weeks later, she finally told a shocked Virginia why. It's worth mentioning that none of us had interacted with Jill before that Session 0. She had been in mandatory quarantine after arriving in this country from Belgium, so Session 0 was really our first time ever getting to know her. And even then, it was largely crowded out by the technicalities of character creation in a system most players were still unfamiliar with. Nonetheless, Jill later showed Virginia screenshots of the messages Freddy had started sending her after that session, confessing to her that he, quote, couldn't help but notice that she had a nice butt, and that he had been looking at her holiday photos on Facebook and was wondering if she had, quote, any more she could show him. Eventually, these messages reached their gory climax, with Freddy confessing to her that he was a virgin, and that reality was having a serious, brutal impact on his mental health, and that, since she was a stranger, and it, quote, wouldn't matter anyway, would she have sex with him to help him overcome his depression. Aware that Freddy was a friend of all of us, Jill had been extremely polite in turning him down, leading Freddy to attempt to effectively swear her to silence about what he had just asked, so that, quote, the group would never know. Days later, she finalized her plans to leave her course and return home to Belgium. Although she never explicitly stated it, both Virginia and myself figure it was to escape from Freddy. She showed Virginia the full text conversation between them, and it caused something of an explosion in the group. Mina in particular was chilled by the text, and began to reevaluate her own experiences with Freddy from earlier that year. She revealed that Freddy had kissed her without warning while they had been alone in her house, and when she registered her very visible discomfort, he'd broken down crying, referring to himself as a, quote, stupid little boy who had just, quote, fucked everything up. This should have been the red flag, as if everything that had happened until now wasn't already. A pattern had started to emerge that I think most of us were trying to ignore, in the name of our friendship with Freddy. Not dissuaded from seemingly driving one girl into my arms, and one girl literally out of the fucking country, Freddy, a couple of months later, would go on to make the same pitch to Virginia, decrying his mental health and identifying his virginity as the cause of all of his woes. He messaged a long ream of text to Virginia, culminating in him asking, quote, adult to adult, Virginia, will you please help me by taking my virginity? When Virginia turned him down, he returned to the by now standard response of having, quote, fucked everything up, and that he was such a, quote, little boy who, quote, couldn't do anything right. Like with Jill, he decided to try convincing Virginia not to say anything to anyone. But by this point, Virginia was already armed with the foreknowledge of what he had asked of Jill, and Mina had separately spoken up to Virginia about her own experiences. We suddenly pieced together all of Freddy's behavior and realized the red flags had started a long time before, with Mina in the springtime. But we had been too blinkered by our friendship with him to see it. Virginia and many of her friends took the stance that Freddy was cynically conniving to harass women and then cover up his actions when rebuffed by citing his mental health issues, acting in despair at being rejected and being overly apologetic to try and prove he knew what he was doing was wrong. They pointed to his attempts to swear both Virginia and Jill to silence as evidence that he knew full well what he was doing, and that he was approaching these conversations with forethought and careful planning. Mina, for her part, thinks he is honestly just this desperate and does not know how to interact with women, and this is the awful result. I think the truth is somewhere between the two sad extremes. Either way, once we had established that this was a trend, it became very clear to us that no woman we ever brought into our little gaming circle would be safe so long as Freddy was present. We had no choice therefore but to remove him. As it happens, we've been in full unyielding lockdown since the new year, so we haven't gotten to play again anyway. But at least we've removed yet another problem player from the ranks. TLDR, INCEL player attempts to stalk, harass, and finally manipulate 3 female players into having sex with him one after the other. It definitely sounds like Freddy needs to learn how to properly interact with women, and that literally begging for sex will never work. Also, using his depression as an excuse for his actions is a scummy move, and an attempt to emotionally manipulate the people he harassed into not holding him to account. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed listening to the story, as creepy as it was. As always, if you have a story you would like to hear read on the channel, be sure to post it to the subreddit r/DnD Doge. Also feel free to @ me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you and hope all of your rolls are natural 20. Also, don't be like Freddy. Until next time.